lean into your authenticity, lean into your story. Again, we celebrate a new generation of winemakers and producers, and I have female winemakers, I have female producers, I have young kids, younger than us, that are leading wineries. I have this one producer from the Azores Islands. He's the youngest winemaker on the island at 22 years old. So, lean into who we are, tell our stories, and know that we have a lot of catching up to do, because Spain and France and Italy, they've been really good at this for a very long time, and they have a lot of money behind to promote. So Portugal basically came online about 30 years ago, as far as the world is concerned. So we have a couple of 100 years to sort of make up for. Good morning, everybody. Bom dia, boa tarde to everybody who might be out of the United States. My name is Sandra Gomes Rocha. I am co-owner of Denise Cellars. We are a boutique Portuguese wine and distributor here in California, specifically Los Angeles. I am a full-blooded Portuguese woman who came to LA actually wanting to work in Hollywood. And after about 10, 15 years of working for some of the major studios and talent agencies in town, I realized that things weren't really fitting for me. And around the same time, I started to delve into the world of wine. And I remember specifically I was having this White Zinfandel after work when I was working at the talent agencies. There's just such a stressful environment that I came home. I was like, I need a drink. So I remember I got to the bottom of this bottle, and there were these. It looked like sand. It looked like crystals at the bottom. I was like, what is this? So that kind of took me on my journey of learning about wine, what makes wine, but then also because I grew up in a very traditional Portuguese household in New Jersey, I knew that Portuguese wine was a thing, but I wasn't really seeing it here. So I started to dig in a little bit more. At some points, I wanted to have a Portuguese wine bar. But I was like, nobody even knows that Portugal exists, let alone where it is on a map. And they're definitely not going to come in for Portuguese wines if they don't know them. So I realized that there was an opportunity to bring Portuguese wines into the market here in California. Now, having grown up on the East Coast, I was surrounded by Portuguese wine because it was our community and it was just there, right? But I hear it was different. So I decided that that's what I needed to do. I need to represent my culture, my people, my land. And we launched Denise Cellars, my husband and I. And I basically go back home to Portugal. I seek out producers. We represent a new generation of winemakers and producers. And I try to find wines that I feel that the Californian palate would understand. Right. So it's not just about focusing on what's authentic and unique about Portuguese wines, but also bringing the type that people here would recognize. And then once they're more familiar with those wines, then we can graduate them up to other wines. So that's been my trajectory. And we've been in this business for about 7 or 8 years. We brought in a first mixed palate in 2018. We've grown ever since. And again, we're still pretty much boutique, but we're really excited about the future of Portuguese wine in California.
Amazing and great to have you, Sandra, as an ambassador for the Portuguese wine as well. I'm not very sure that how exactly it was 5 years before, but now when we are seeing Midwest, when we are seeing California, there's a huge demand of all these regions which are popping up, and Portugal is being one of the regions. And I'm sure that we have many wineries attending the call from Portugal as well. So
yes.
Let's pick up our first question, which is, I think, was one of the most common questions which has been asked. What are the biggest challenges does Portuguese winery face while entering in the US market? The question was also if you can just shed a little bit of light on the 3-tier system as well, that how it works, not very in depth, but a couple of people wanted to know that how does it works. And among the challenges, if you have any solutions that a lot of Portuguese wine brands have already used while entering in the US market, you can shed light on that as well.
Yes, for sure. So one of the things that I think is the biggest challenge, not just for wineries, but all of us working with Portuguese wine, is essentially what what led me to open up my business in the first place, which is lack of awareness. The fact that people don't know that, first of all, that Portugal even makes wine, let alone, and if they do know that Portugal makes wine, what kind of wines does it make, right? So Portuguese wine is actually, it has a really deep history with American history. The Declaration of Independence was signed with Madeira. Our founding fathers were drinking Madeira wine, when they were with the birth of our country, right? So Portuguese wine in the American history is very important. It goes very deep. However, people don't know where Portugal is on a map. They started to discover 5 years ago, they didn't, right? But now they're starting to actually travel there, but they don't know what these wines are. So maybe they only know ports and they only know Vinho Verde, if that. Another challenge is, the perceptions of the wines themselves. So one of the first wines that came into the United States was Lancers back in the 80s. And it was great to put Portugal on a map in terms of like people knowing that this is a region that exists. But what that did also, as well as the Mateus, that was another big brand that came into the United States, was that people now have the perception that Portuguese wine is supposed to be cheap, right? So they're looking at wines and they're like, why is this wine $35, $40 at the shelf, right? Where in reality, there is an incredible value to be had in Portuguese wines, but Portugal itself as a region needs to do a lot on the back end to help change this mindset. And people like me who are on the ground, that's what we do every day, right? Portuguese wine is still a hand sell. Right, you don't have people coming into a shop and say, "Hey, I want your best bottle of Portuguese wine." This is California. This is the mecca of wine. So that's your competition. You're competing against a world-recognized region, and that is the palate that people have. So how do you introduce people to a region that's been around for a long time, whose palate is different? Right. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen, first of all. And people like me are doing it on the ground. But we also need help from Portugal and from our winery partners. So just to give an example, this year I launched the first Portuguese Wine Week in Los Angeles. And I was inspired by Prosecco Week and Cava Week, which are two major events that happen nationwide. And they're each supported and launched by their respective countries. Portugal is not doing that. And I reached out to some Portuguese organizations for help and support. I did not get that help and support. So that's the biggest challenge is people think that Portuguese wine should be cheap. People don't know that Portugal even makes wine. They're not as familiar with the quality and the diversity of the regions. And it's all education. So I think that's something that we have to do as a group is come together and actually try to move that needle by really putting a lot of support and supporting people like these independent importers and distributors who are doing the work on the ground.
I think that's important because when we ask wine brands that what sort of support programs they can give to importers and distributors, there are tons. And that is what I think is what exactly we're expecting from not only the wineries, but also the associations, the boards also to help push it in the US market.
Yeah, and we are trying to do a lot of events, but events right now, I think across the board are becoming difficult. I think that people don't have as much of an attention span. But as much as we can is just getting the support, not just from the wineries, but from Portuguese organizations back home.
Correct. Yes. And I think this is in the continuation to what you already said, that there's a huge competition for Portuguese wine, not with the Portuguese wine themselves, but there's a whole different regions that they're competing against. So how can Portuguese wines differentiate themselves from other European wines that are already well established? So I think what consumer or what, let's say, trade is looking for, what is the newness? What is the USP of Portuguese wine? Is there a demand in the consumer that you see? Are there trades? Is there an on-premise demand that you see of Portuguese wine?
It's the demand is either a push or pull situation, right? You are having a lot of people that are traveling to Portugal and they're finally coming back home to say, hey, I was just in Portugal and I'd love to see, what you have on the menu. And the on-premise world and even the off-premise world, they need those people to come in the door and ask for those wines. So how do we get people to know that the wine exists, right? And then to go in and ask for it, right? So tourism has a lot to do with it. And I love that Portugal has become such a focus in the last couple of years. I mean, let me tell you, every time I go to Portugal and I come back, I happen to be sitting next to somebody who just bought a property in Lisbon or the Algarve or somewhere else in Portugal. So people are traveling there, they're coming back, and they're finally starting to say, hey, I had this great wine. What is here? So that's what the retail industry here, what they need to see and hear. There just isn't, you don't have a large group of people going into a big bottle shop and saying, I want all your Portuguese wine. Right. So, but again, but that's a long lead, that's a long plan. And the way that we differentiate ourselves is to be authentic, to lean into who we are, to lean into what makes us different, right? So I know that there are producers out there, there are wineries out there that are making a 100% Malbec, they're making a 100% Chardonnay or 100% Sauvignon Blanc. I can tell you that as an importer, I'm not bringing those wines in. Because first of all, you know, in California, Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot, those are your strong varietals. So to bring in a varietal that even though it might do well in Portugal, here, you're essentially dead on arrival, right? So lean into your authenticity, lean into your story. Again, we celebrate a new generation of winemakers and producers, and I have female winemakers, I have female producers, I have young kids, younger than us, that are leading wineries. I have this one producer from the Azores Islands. He's the youngest winemaker on the island at 22 years old. So, you know, lean into who we are, tell our stories, and know that we have a lot of catching up to do, because Spain and France and Italy, they've been really good at this for a very long time, and they have a lot of money behind to promote. So Portugal basically came online about 30 years ago, as far as the world is concerned. So we have a couple of 100 years to sort of make up for.
Yes. And I think that you're right, that there has to be a lot of consumer pull, and that we need to do for Portugal region, because there has to be word of mouth, there has to be proper storytelling, there has to be a proper marketing that needs to be done to reach to consumer and reach to trade. So I think that's an important point for all the brands out there. So I think this is almost similar, but what consumer trends in the US are showing the most interest in the Portuguese wines, and how can wineries tap into these trends? Are there any specific Portuguese wine that you think is picking up a little bit quickly, or compared to other wine brands which are entering in the market?
So I think that the Vinho Verde wines are, you know, people know about them a lot more, and they are a growing category. You also have a lot of focus on sustainability and natural wines. And I think that Portuguese wines can lean into that in terms of like the freshness. And look, we have winemaking ancestry going back thousands of years. So again, like leaning into that sustainability and that history. But, you know, monovarietals, I think, are really starting to pop up, especially varietals that they just started recently hearing about, like Touriga Nacional. I always talk about how it's the varietal that's the most similar to Cabernet Sauvignon. So Touriga Nacional for Portugal is what Cabernet Sauvignon is to Napa, for example, or even to France. So this is a heat-loving varietal. It's planted everywhere. It's the backbone of all of our red wines in our ports. And now having it as a monovarietal, I think it's starting to pick up steam, because when we launched, we just wanted to place Portugal on the map. We just wanted people to know that Portugal was here and what the value add was. And then we were going to graduate them into more higher end, more defined monovarietals, because we first need to say, hey, we're here. This is who we are. And we're great and wonderful. We're a value. We're delicious. And now that you know that we're here, then let me break it down for you as far as like what like true special qualities we have. So I think that those are the key factors, right? But again, not going to the noble varieties coming out of Portugal. I think that we need to lean into our own. But sustainability, natural wines, and Vinho Verde is growing. But also, I think that Alentejo is a really important region for us. And the reason why is that because, at least in California, the way that I place the region in people's minds is, I say, if you like a California red or a California white, then go to the Alentejo, because you're going to get those characters with that flavor profile. And that's what people are starting to focus on right now, for sure.
Where it becomes easy, Sandra, to pitch the Portuguese wine brands? Is it easy for them to pitch to on-premise or off-premise, just with your experience?
You know, I have more luck in the off-premise.
Interesting.
Because, you know, again, it's a bottle that you can see. You have an entire like section of it, and those sections are starting to grow, right? What I'm seeing on the on-premise is maybe one or two wines on the menu. But also in California, you don't have a great deal of Portuguese wine restaurants. You don't have Portuguese restaurants, period.
Yeah,
you
so
have
I was coming,
maybe a handful.
correct. So that was my question, that do you think that there is a lack of food pairability, maybe the option, or
there's a lot of challenges surrounding that, you know. Even again, if you were to be on the East Coast, the plethora of amazing Portuguese restaurants, you know, they're never ending. They're not here yet, but we do see that growing. So with that in mind, again, you go into these on-premise locations and you're talking about how gastronomic these wines are, right? And trying to pair their menu to what you have, because that's one of the value propositions with Portugal, is the fact that these wines go with basically every cuisine, right? But not necessarily every restaurant is going to want to have a Portuguese wine. So for example, where I live, there's 10 Italian restaurants for every one of literally everything else. But when you go to these Italian restaurants, it's primarily Italy and California, right? So I do see, I have better access to off-premise than on-premise, but on-premise is important to grow these brands as well.
Correct. But on-premise, off-premise comes with a lot of other challenges as well. There's a lot of competition that everybody is going to face. So.
There is. And, you know, any opportunity that we have to have programs or education, we do, and those certainly help by leaps and bounds.
Sure. How important, I think we touched base, but if you can just set a couple of examples, how important is storytelling and cultural heritage in marketing Portuguese wine to US consumers?
I think it's incredibly important because, well, that's one of the things that sets you apart, right? And also when you think about the consumer base, especially like, you know, your 20-something to maybe your 50-year-olds, they care about what they consume, who they support, what goes in their bodies, right? And it's all about connecting the dots, right? And I just love telling the stories of my producers and also my connection to the country. And to me, I consider myself an extension of these producers or these brands, right? Like, I'm not just an importer, just like, oh, this, you know, this is what I have and that's it.
Yes.
I go in as an actual representative, as if that were my family, right? And tell them the stories of just how wine for us in the Portuguese community, I always say that Portuguese wine for us was, you know, it was just like a cousin. It's always at the table. It's there every day. It's just something that's there. You don't have to think about it. So leaning into the culture, into the history is very important because people want to have that connection to the things that they're consuming. So whether it's a good meal, whether it's a wine, whether it's, you know, some other consumer product, it's just like, how do I feel about consuming this particular good, and why am I supporting this producer or this company? So when people buy you, they buy you. They don't necessarily buy the product. So if I found that for my producers to have really interesting stories, it's just like people are amazed, like, oh my God, I had no idea. You know, so they love hearing how small and quaint these wineries are and just how passionate we are. I have 1,000 stories that I tell, but yes, it's incredibly important. And that's why these wineries, they need to figure out who they are and who they want to be in the market, right? you don't want to be like everybody else, and you don't want to be a wine that creates a product for the market. You want to be a producer that creates really good stuff that anybody across the world would have as is, right? So for example, we are not bringing in wines that are not wines in Portugal. There's a lot of wines here from Portugal that you are not finding in Portugal because they're not actual Portuguese wines, right? So it's incredibly important.
Amazing. I think that makes sense. Even when people Google your brand and go to your website, the first thing that they want to see is not the technical sheet, to be honest, but the first thing that they see is about the wine brand, who are making it, what is the story behind it. So I'm sure that's the number one point for any wine brand.
Because it's all about connectivity, and in this age of technology, you want to know that there are people behind the brands, and these are humans with lives and children and family, so yeah.
Are there specific regions or states in the US where Portuguese wines are more popular or have more growth potential? So I think we discussed a little bit like East having the most of the opportunities. But what about what about California? What about the Midwest? What would you say that to the brands?
So I will speak about my own experience. Of course, growing up on the East Coast, the whole New England from Massachusetts down to Rhode Island, even down to Florida. There's a lot of Portuguese there. There's a lot of Portuguese immigrants there. So there's quite a bit of saturation. However, if you are a brand that has something really special and unique, that is a great opportunity because there's already a market there, right? In California, because again, this is California and they have incredible wines, there's still a strong international market. San Francisco is important for the imports because, it's really funny. It's like when we are at a place that's unique and it's a vacation for everybody else, or it's a destination for everybody else, we're like, it's here. I can go whenever, you don't really make that much of an effort. So for Californians, knowing that Napa is right up the street, they're like, I've had Napa. What else is out there? Right. So here, I think there's an opportunity for growth, but again, it's all about education, and Portuguese wine is still a hand sell. You still have to really push that one bottle because people are just not as familiar because again, this is California. Now, in between, in those sort of like middle states, for example, I have a friend that used to work on one of my clients. Her family's from North Dakota, and she went back home for a couple of months, and we were starting to investigate about whether it makes sense to import Portuguese wines into North Dakota and set up a distribution system there. And we found that that is primarily a beer drinking state. A lot of your states within the center of the United States are beer and spirits, right? When you take a look about the outside of the country, so you're thinking Chicago, Austin, Texas, Oregon, like all those places on the border, that's where you're going to have your largest concentration of people who are more affluent, who are traveling more, who are more worldly, and who are more interested in what's in the outside. The closer you get into the country, the more domestic beer, whiskey, bourbon you're going to be drinking. So, but that's not to say that there aren't opportunities. It's just going to be a lot more difficult because again, education. Yeah. It's all about education. All about education. Yeah.
Correct. So we see East, but that has been a little saturated, but we still see a little bit of opportunities in West and in the outskirts of Midwest.
Yeah. And to give people an idea of scale for people who don't know like what California is, LA County. Just LA County has 10 million people. That's the same number of people that Portugal as a whole has. California is the 5th largest economy in the world, right? 3 Portugals can fit into California. So just on its own, it's an incredible market. And you have to think about every other state in the United States as an independent country. So there was a question earlier about the 3-tier system, right? In California, I can be an importer and a distributor, right? But I cannot have a retail store. I can, but I can sell online, right? If I want to sell in any other state outside of California, I have to look for a distributor and then work with them. So people need to think about the United States as honestly a continent with a bunch of different countries that have a bunch of different laws, and the way that they drink is different from state to state to state. So focus on East and West, or Chicago or Texas. And then you can grow from there, but don't come in, try to tackle the entire country, because
With the same.
it's impossibility. Yeah.
All right. So coming up next is on the pricing. What do you think that the Portuguese wine brands, while entering in the US market, should play around with the pricing strategies? What they should keep as a checklist to how to set their price right?
Again, there's the perception that Portuguese wine is meant to be cheap, right? So you very rarely see wines that are retailing for north of $50 or $60. You're starting to see them. So as far as their pricing is concerned, a lot of my clients, they are liking wines that at our cost are between the €2 and change to about €7 and change. That's like that's the euro cost of the wines at the cellar, right? By the time they land here, they're anywhere between retail, anywhere between $12 and maybe $30. So that's where we're seeing a lot of opportunity. That's not to say that we can't go higher. And again, we're trying to graduate everybody up, but it's all about the value proposition. Because if you have a $50 California red and a $50 Portuguese red, they're widely different. Yes. But the perception is that the Portuguese wine at that price point is too expensive. So definitely have different tiers, but have something special that people will be willing to pick up for sure.
I think this is one question that you can straight away answer based on your experience. How can Portuguese wineries build a strong partnership with US distributors and retailers?
It's
Sandra, one more thing. Tell us what exactly are your challenges, and also what is your dream list of what sort of support are you expecting from Portuguese wine?
Having people come to market, I think that really helps, but also having, I think it's important for there to be a body, and these bodies exist, that help market and build up noise in the market that are independent from us. So we're on the ground doing the work. A lot of people think that once they sell the product to an importer, they're set. That's actually when the work begins, right? I think that the way that we can solidify or we can strengthen relationships, these writers can strengthen relationships with us, is just be in the market, coming through. Of course, like these support programs are really important. What is your marketing budget, right? And trying to do whatever you can to sort of get that noise out there. There's a lot of brands out there that are spending a lot of money. They're taking up the attention of everyone. So that personal touch is really important. I just had one of my export managers here from one of my largest producers in Portugal, and I took him around and we had a good time. And when he calls me up and say, "Hey, I have this new wine," I was like, "Yeah, send me a piece, and we'll see what we can do." And it's like, for me personally, these relationships, I treat them like they're family, because they literally feel like family to me, right? So looking at your importers and your suppliers as your partners, not your clients, right? It's like they're people, they're there to help you. So how do you help family? How do you help your friends? And that's I think doing that will really go a long way.
True, because often brands think that sending and doing one deal is all it takes, but I think that repeat business, that recurring business, only comes when you don't treat them as somebody who is just an importer or a distributor or a retailer, but more like a partner. So we definitely need that handhold till it sells to the consumer. There has to be tasting. You have to go to retail and see where the space is. Does it even look catchy to a consumer who comes and see for a Portuguese wine? So I think there are numerous steps that can Portuguese wine. And very well said that they have to come and see you. There has to be a handshake at least once in a year that has been expected.
Yeah, and look, and a lot of my producers, they're so small where maybe that's an impossibility, right? Maybe it's cost prohibitive for them to come once a year, every 2 years, and that's fine, right? But then how else can we work together? And there's a lot of different ways to do so, but seeing your partners as true partners, right? And building that life with them, because I see this as a long lead game, right? Correct. But if I have a producer where they're trying to push everything on me, I can't. The way that I relate to my producers is that we bring in your stuff, we bring in a few cases just to see how it does, and then I give you that feedback, and we keep communicating and we keep learning. And if they have any ideas for us, we'll take them, right? So not just looking at us as the end results, but actually the beginning of that partnership and building those relationships.
Amazing. That brings us to our last question, but this is very interesting one. So as you said in between as well, that there's a huge opportunity in direct to sales as well. So D2C is something where it becomes easy because there's a lot of in between hurdles that you overcross and you directly sell it to consumer. But apart from that, what role does online sales and e-commerce platforms? So here we are not just talking, we are talking about omni-channels here. So how do you think that this is going to help Portuguese wine to reach more US consumers? And is there any best way that you can suggest them to use these channels?
So here's what I've seen with my own. Our e-commerce, direct-to-consumer part of the business is the smallest part of our business because that on itself is a completely different business model, right? And we have that available because we have friends and family and people in other areas that would love to have our wines. They're just not near a place that sells our wines. But what I've been finding the value of e-commerce to be is not necessarily in the, easy access, right? But it's in what it informs us of. From time to time, I get a random order from somewhere, from somebody I've never heard of. And when I reach out and say, hey, thank you for your order. How did you hear about those? They say, I went to Portugal. I went to this winery. They said that you were the importer, and here we are. I Googled you, and I placed the order. So that tells me that demand is starting to increase. So I use the e-commerce channel as a research tool that gives me feedback from the market because people are specifically looking for these brands. So having wineries being able to receive tourists, to be able to receive people from the U.S., and then having that relationship with the importer or the distributor and say, hey, this is where you can find, the brands. And a lot of distributors and importers don't necessarily have an e-commerce site. But still having the ability for the wineries to be able to receive visitors, offering them that experience, and then having a way for them to purchase those wines when they get back home is really important. So, but for us, we're seeing it more as an information tool versus a specific part of our business that we spend a lot of time and resources on.
I have one question for you, Sandra, before we take up any question in the Q&A. Being an importer and a distributor as well, what is your checklist of selecting a brand? So I'm sure that there must be tons of brand approaching you for entering in the market. How do you pick a brand?
So there's a couple of things, and this is a really good question. I look for like-minded people. So again, a new generation. So these are folks who are really focused on sustainability, on going back to their roots. Let me give you an example. One of my producers, I call him my OG because he's one of the first four that we brought in. He's a young guy. He went to go get his master's vintners degree, and he took land that belonged to his family from the 1690s. and it had been vacant for over 30 years. And this land was everything from a farm to, they raised cattle and sheep. So it had different life cycles since the 1600s, right? So here's a young man who says, I have this vacant land and I'm going to take this and I'm going to plant what works really well here. And that's who we're after, right? We're not after the big companies that make millions of bottles a year. We're looking for that small family. Again, we're looking for the connectivity, the heritage, the story, right? Because if I'm saying these producers are small and they're really focused on sustainability and really making the best wine that they can while keeping their soils healthy, that's important. There's a lot of established brands that, there's some brands in the United States that, again, I question how Portuguese they are because of how small the country is and the volume that they're making. I would rather go to somebody who, even if they don't own all their grapes, but they source from really good sources and then make something that is that's unique, that's personal, it's not oversized, and they're able to actually keep a level of control in their quality. So if it's like your big brand or your big company that makes millions of bottles a year, we're not going to do that, because also it's like, I want to help grow these brands. I want to help these families grow. And the way that we can do that is together, as a unit. So like wants like.
Interesting to know.
Yeah.
An importer's perspective as well. So I think we just received one additional question, Sandra. And the question is how to position new port brands in the US market. So I think we pretty much must have answered, but in case, if you just quickly want to give it just to.
Quality is absolutely, a great position, authenticity, and the unique style of the wine and the region, right? So it's all about the story. The pricing is really important. Again, focusing on what makes you different, right? If you are, a grandpa that started this brand 50 years ago, and your wine is everywhere, it's like, how is that different from the people who are already on the market, or people who are trying to come in? So position yourself in terms of your quality, what makes your brand different, and your pricing structure is going to be really important. Yeah. And doing some market research yourselves. I mean, like, I think that there's enough information out there to know who's here. And then, how they're selling, where they're selling. And again, figure out who you want to be in that market. And then seek out the importers and distributors that have the same values as you do. And that way you can come in and you can grow successfully.
Sure. I think there's a lot of homework to any Portuguese brand that needs to be done, to which market they want to enter, to which consumer that they want to target to, plus where they want to pitch. Is it going to be the on-premise or off-premise? So I think there's a lot of strategies that needs to be done before they plan to enter in the US market. So amazing, Sandra. I think that was the last question that we had for the day. Any other in general tip or something that you want to give to the brands?
Know that this is going to take a long time. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of excitement about Portuguese wines. And I think that there's just an incredible amount of opportunity left for everyone in the space. And also, it's like, for example, inflation is a big deal, not only in the United States, but also the markets abroad. So having a delicious, high quality wine at a reasonable price point, I think that's Portugal's strongest value proposition, and leaning into that. So, but again, education, it takes education and marketing and awareness. So there's a lot to be optimistic about, for sure.
Understood. Yeah. One last question, just my personal question. So apart from US, where is Portuguese wine brands are more in demand? So globally, where do you export for?
So I don't export, but I can tell you what my brands are seeing, or some of the bigger brands. China, of course, is an important market. Japan is an important market for some regions, not all. So, for example, if you are a region from the north of Portugal where your wines are fresher.
Mhm.
Japan would be like Vinho Verde in Japan. I mean, it's just like the seafood, the oysters, all the things that, that make sense. Alentejo ones, not so much because they're bigger and bolder. But so Asians, of course, are really big. Brazil, of course, has always been a really big market for Portuguese wines. But I think America will always be the mecca for all these producers, and we want to help them come in and be successful. And one of the other things that I will actually tell your wineries present, work with your vintner commissions, with your CVs, right? So with the commission for the Down, Vinho Verde Alentejo, work with them to help bring support into the market. Because it's not just about getting wine here. Yes, again, that's the first step. But then if we help to grow those regions and those products here, that will open up the space for others. That will open up the space for more categories. But Portugal needs to be involved 100%. And I don't think Portugal is as involved as they need to. So I would say the wineries and the producers need to put a little bit of pressure on their commissions and their regions to help support the market, because we can't do it alone.